Creating Pilgrimage, Breast Cancer and Destiny. Read by the author, Dr. Evangeline Rand.
This is a story about a text that got stuck. My text. I thought the text had been finished, but it wasn't. The original text was a story about Mary Magdalene. The new text that I'm writing is called Creating Pilgrimage, Breast Cancer and Destiny. The first chapter had started like this: the void that begs the question, the lacuna of Mary Magdalene. I thought this document was nearly finished in the year 2000. I knew this was not true when I was diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer in 2001. Then I felt as though I had become the void that begs the question. Although 12 years previously my mother had died from breast cancer and its later metastases, I had no idea how my life would evolve. We make our plans and forget that life can change them in a second. Interestingly enough, though, I had had a dream of having breast cancer over 25 years ago. A couple of years later, when my mother was diagnosed, I rashly thought I must have been carrying some of her pain, and that now my mother had been diagnosed with cancer, I would simply be relieved of that burden. What hubris, I now think. Life is much more complex. Back then, I must have decided that I would get on with my life as fully as possible and hope for the best. I did this, knowing full well that there was a strong likelihood that this cancer was perhaps genetically linked to me. And certainly I paid attention to my health states, exercise, and all the other good things that we do to take care of ourselves. I also didn't want to be too good. I have a healthy suspicion of so-called goodness that leaves out deep humanity. When I was diagnosed in December of 2001, the cancer was apparent exactly where my dream life had pictured it all those years ago. That dream had terrified me enough to start my reading about cancer, its mystery, its horror, and its metaphors. For many years, I have realized that dreams demand something of us by way of a response. It's not enough to just wonder about them. They have their own demands. Through my connections with the early development of biofeedback and the newly developed appreciation of wholeness and interconnections of our minds, bodies, and souls, and of ourselves with the world around us, I was fortunate enough to come across some of the writings of Dr. Russell Lockhart, in particular his essay on cancer in myth and dream. This was to be the beginning of a long mentoring relationship with him. I will always be indebted to him for his love of soul and his attention to her details. When I was able to do therapeutic touch for my mother just before her surgery, I had been able to feel the pulsing energy of the tumorous mass through my hands held above this place of suffering. It seemed to me that there was a tremendous paradox here. I could sense the life force so deeply in my hands, albeit in patterns that I had not felt before, and yet this was the place of my mother's suffering that ultimately led to her death. I wouldn't have had these words of paradox at that time, but I have stayed with a sense of marvel that life and death could be in such intimate embrace. My life did not evolve around cancer and my fear of it. I had a family, home, and friends to cherish. I had writing to do and pilgrimages to lead. My life as a psychologist was enormously demanding and thoroughly educative and enlivening for me. I can honestly say that there has never been a day when I resented going to work. I felt honored to be attending to the depths of life and the growing of humanity. During the previous 15 years, most of my recreational time had been spent learning about Mary Magdalene and her newly evolving, broadly significant and mysterious story. You may have come to find more interest in her through the very popular book, The Da Vinci Code. As I was writing that sentence, a friend from Switzerland had phoned me to tell me that the book was on the bestseller list in Europe as well. You'll remember that time. You will also read later or hear later how a dream introduced her to me and how later dreams have evolved around this mysterious figure. My interest in her has been neither sudden nor expected. Though for many years, about 40, I have not had any particular religious affiliations, imaginations of Mary Magdalene kept insinuating themselves into my life. Before my illness, I had come to think that the teachings of an initiatory tomb experience must indeed be profound. They must be truths that we can't learn anywhere else except deep in the earth, experiencing our complete inertness until we realize that something else is the enlivening force, something other than our willpower. I didn't have these words then, but I had wondered if the presiding women at Christianity's initiatory tomb had something to teach me. I had twice been to the center of the large pyramid of Giza in Egypt, wondering about possible initiation rites that some authorities consider to have been enacted in there. And I had felt the effects of the enormous mass of stone all around me. I could understand very well that one would have to be thoroughly at home in the essential world of the imagination and self-discipline in order to endure the experience of being held in a stone sarcophagus or cave and coming through the testing ordeal, not merely as a tourist spectator, but as one prepared to step into liminal territory, surrender to the experience, and then come back, if that's what happens, to sculpt the experience into meaning, letting it affect the rest of your life. The ancient Greeks seemed to understand this too. The wise person, they said, would go into a cave, become awakened through mystery, and then come back to the city to let that awakening flow into world and civic affairs. This perhaps sounds very unfamiliar to our modern ears. Yes, for many years I had studied in depth the work of Carl Jung, and through my own work I knew full well that an encounter with the unconscious, the ocean of the unconscious, is no trifling matter. It's not usually something we only experience once. Indeed, during the 6 months of my chemotherapy, I dreamed of drowning. I couldn't pull to form the oceanic rough white horses' manes, the chaotic waveforms of my inner world. I didn't have the strength in my arms to swim through the rough waters. Of course I couldn't. I was just human, and I was very ill. I could only work with 1 drop of water at a time. I thought I had been doing this for many years, but now I had to go even more slowly. Viktor Frankl, whose work I returned to during my illness, wrote about his surviving of the Nazi concentration camp and what he learned in that horror about our search for meaning in life. He said that they, the prisoners, had nothing except their bare bodies, their naked existence. Even their hair was gone. He did notice the development of a grim sense of humor and a curiosity along with an apathy from watching brutal sights that became more and more familiar. This was a lifesaver, he said. I have felt a certain resonance with some of these experiences, though I could certainly not claim to have gone through wartime Nazi concentration camp. Nonetheless, Frankl maintains that how we bear suffering, how we bear our existence restricted by external forces, is a genuine achievement. It's the same for all people, he maintains, who are confronted with fate. One of his realizations touched me most profoundly. He said that his mind clung to his wife, not knowing if she was dead or alive. And he finally realized that love is the ultimate and highest goal to which mankind can aspire. He suggests that this love goes far beyond a particular person, but rather it finds its deepest meaning in his spiritual being, and it matters not whether the beloved person is present or alive. Art and nature began to matter to him more and more. One day, during the interminable digging of ditches, he had just realized his wife's continual presence and his love of her, when a little bird flew down and landed on mud from the ditch he had been creating. Viktor Frankl said that the prisoners of the camp began to see the meaning of life, embraced the wider circles of life and death, suffering and dying. He came to see that meaning boils down to becoming aware of what can be done actually in a situation and then doing it. We find meaning through actualizing the potential inherent and dormant in a given situation. Thus, meaning must be an individual process. It's rather an unusual statement about the meaning of life. I like it. There is room for the facts of the matter and the matter of facts. One recognizes the actual limits of the situation. Yet, our imagination, creativity, and action are fundamental requirements for meaning to arise within us. Sometimes these potent acts are something as simple as deciding to pull open the curtains one day. That might be taxing enough. For a long time, I have also wondered about the deep intelligence of matter, and as best as I was able to, I have pondered on the works of such researchers and writers as David Bohm, David Peat, both physicists, Mae Wan Ho and Rupert Sheldrake, biologists, Ervin Laszlo, theorist, Alan Coombs, psychologist and theorist, Omar Chu and Matthew Fox, theologians, Keith Critchlow, professor of architecture, master teacher of sacred geometry, and many others. I loved it all. What is this deep mystery we call life? I suppose now I could say that this is the attractor question that has drawn me from the beginning. How am I caught up in life? What is life? What is this great love that seems to be the essence of it all, the great love that renders me speechless more and more of the time? A dear friend reminds me that Socrates wanted a love that takes him not to something or someone, but that opens his awareness beyond attachment to the beautiful, the good, the just, the various faces of being itself. To be beyond attachment is a phrase I have never liked. Knowing how it is often used to justify callous behavior towards others and a certain ignorance. Besides, I've always been interested in attachment, particularly the attachment between babies and their mothers, and the deep intelligence and learning that flows out of that situation for mother and baby. Now, I think that to be beyond attachment must have something to do with a loving silence, or seeking silence, or dwelling within it, of recognizing that the beautiful, the good, and the just are as much part of my fundamental being as it is of the world around me. This is not about making an effort in this or that direction, but to love is being in silent dialogue with matters of beauty and justice, but nothing to do with moral codes. And yes, it was me who fell into the black hole, the void. It has taken me 2.5 years even to begin to find words to tell this story, and I'm telling it now, 10 years after that. Often, though, I realize that perhaps I don't need to tell this story. I am totally enchanted with my granddaughter. She has no words and will likely never have any. Everyone feels blessed by time in her presence, not in her presence alone, but also in the presence of her mother's and father's unconditional love and incredibly hard practical work of caring. You see, not only was I diagnosed with aggressive cancer, between my first 2 surgeries, my darling little granddaughter was diagnosed with Angelman syndrome. I am learning more and more the meaning of curious statement made by the court lexicographer to Queen Isabella of Spain on the eve of Spain's conquest of the New World. He was putting forward his case for the compiling of a new dictionary. "Language, Your Highness," he said, "is a perfect instrument of empire." So true. Love, on the other hand, does not construct empires. It brings soothing and animation to the human soul. Paradoxically, the profound silence of love, when we can endure it, allows us to stay open to the world around us. At first, I was in shock over my own diagnosis and heartbroken at losing what I thought of as my life. I had to stop working, had to sell my house, moved into a small condominium, gave away or sold many of my possessions, doing my best to surrender to the situation as it was, yet trying to keep living my life, when much of the time, through surgeries, chemotherapy and radiation, I felt I could barely focus my eyes, barely hear anything, barely take another breath. I wanted and needed the deepest simplicity I could create for myself. Actually, at the beginning of my crisis of health, I felt deeply betrayed by my soul. I had no other warnings about this diagnosis. In fact, the dream I had just before the fateful diagnosis day was a strange dream of 10 Indian elephants, dressed for a celebration, walking side by side across the grass towards our own Edmonton pyramids, 4 pyramids of glass, each having a different climate that houses plants from around the world. The elephants were pulling something strange behind them that to this day I do not recognize. I was looking at something like an 8-sided cylindrical pillar rolling along. The ends of the structure were drawn into 8-sided cones. Its function was to provide radical pruning to the grass that surrounds our pyramid conservatories. Obviously, one doesn't argue with or step in the way of an elephant, let alone 10 of them. I wondered why these Indian elephants had come to visit me from the land of my birth and early years. I could sense that they brought a very big change with them. Obviously, one doesn't usually need 10 Indian elephants to cut the grass. Quite obviously, Soul's perspective on the unfolding situation was not one of obvious and final catastrophe, though I did have a sense of catastrophe. For the large creatures of my soul, there was a cause for celebration and for their mission. The total situation forced me to rethink my whole life, to reassess everything, and I was furious. It's not really that I had to rethink everything. It is more that everything about my life, as I had thought of it, was smashed to nothingness. I have had to make enormous efforts to construct a new life, and it's only now that I can say I'm thankful for all I have learned in the last 2 years. And don't forget, it's still 10 years later now. In fact, though, I know less than I ever knew. And this process also continues. Most of the time, I haven't wanted to write at all. My journal notes are scanty and almost illegible. Often I wished I no longer existed. But death comes at its own time. Sometimes it's harder to live. And I'm not at all sure that we don't live after life anyway. I was disoriented, sad, physically handicapped in numerous ways, and ways that you don't necessarily hear about or read about in most literature. And I've been alone. This is a different experience than going through the cancer diagnosis with a partner. Probably neither one is worse than the other, but have their own complications. I did have to confess my envy to a dear friend who went through her cancer experience with her deeply loving and loved husband. I was jealous of the second honeymoons she wrote about being dispersed through her suffering. Sometimes I just longed to hear someone rattle a teacup in my house. The silence hurt my ears. And then there was a time when my oncologist suggested I try and take a small holiday. "You are worn out with self-care," she said. That was true. In spite of all the help and support from friends, I had had too much silence at a time when I needed care, and I did take a holiday. I went back to Europe, reconnected with family and friends as though I'd never been away from them. This was medicine indeed. I think it is important for people who are suffering, particularly those who are incurably suffering, and perhaps in some way that is really all of us, to have an opportunity to be proud of what they have suffered and endured. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about glorying in being a victim. I'm talking about what one has accomplished and achieved. Victims can't do that. They continually say, "I can do," and they go on to tell about some events that they are going to accomplish in the future and usually never do. Gregory Bateson reminds us that this can be an obsessive acceptance of a challenge, a repudiation of the proposition, "I cannot." Victims can do anything in their fantasy life. In fact, they are ruled by an empty fantasy life and have little life of the imagination. A recoverer within acute suffering, on the other hand, accomplishes something. This may be simply the ability to say, "I cannot," or the ability to walk with life into death. Now I think I wouldn't know what to answer if someone was to say to me, "What is suffering?" I don't know. I do know that today a woman in our Arts in Medicine program said that she had read a story in the newspaper of a man in court who said he had forgiven the man who attacked him and tried to stab him. He said that the experience had made him change his life. We could all relate to this, and I, for one, was grateful to hear a different ethos coming out of a courtroom, an ethos that shows and appreciates the deep connection between the wound and the weapon. Here was a victim who moved beyond blame towards an understanding of his indebtedness to his assailant. I do know that also today I hear a story of soldiers cut off from their comrades. Radio contact was broken. They were surrounded by their enemies, and suddenly, from the airway of a small neighboring country, they unintentionally picked up the strains of a Schubert sonata that was what became significant to them. This seems to be my experience of illness and suffering. Every now and then, in the valley of loss, I have heard bits and pieces of the Schubert sonata, enough to make me recognize that it is there and I want to hear more. What I have going for me has been the wonderful experience of the Arts in Medicine program at the Cross Cancer Institute, brought into being and sustained by Dr. Marilyn Hundleby, and the associated Tapestry Weekend Healing Experience. I surrendered to become a patient. There was no choice. However, this is not a program for art therapy at diagnosis. This is about creating in safety. I have grown to love the group of women and the few men with whom I meet regularly. Talk is straight. It seems to me to become more and more profound. There is laughter and crying, and there is creation. There are no responsive comments made by others, no interpretations or injunctions, in other words, no verbal cruelty. We are free to move in our own creations, at our own pace, in our own style. I have realized all over again how listening to the other, creating quietly together, is so deeply healing for all concerned. Its effects are almost magical. This is nothing new. Everyone knows this nowadays, but it is rare to find it as a living, ongoing reality, where the underlying value system acknowledges the recognition that we all have within us, as organisms, the fundamental growth capacity towards wholeness. We, the people who are living with a cancer diagnosis, all know why we are here and why we were in the Arts in Medicine program. There's no need for pretense or power struggles. At first I couldn't stop crying, but I was touched by the art materials which were provided. They were always beautiful, of exceptional quality, and scaled to our capacity. My work play has been so slow. This was a shock in itself for me. After all, I had lovingly provided materials for creative engagement for others for many years, and I'd been involved with my own creative endeavors all my life. I had no idea that I would lose the normal functioning of my hands and have to regain it slowly. It was painful to realize that my natural capacity had become so very small. Sometimes I'm grateful to have alive within me a passion for following questions, images, and ideas that arise within me. I'm grateful that Dr. Marilyn Hundleby has encouraged me to stay with these passions on whatever scale I could manage. She showed interest in my ideas, insights, and experiences, even when I found myself to have holes in my brain and memory losses. Trauma does this to us. There was never any hint from either of us that we were in denial about my obvious plight and sufferings. I thought I remembered one day that Gregory Bateson wrote his last book when he was diagnosed with cancer. Many people, it seems, have lived their lives into death. This is what I've wanted to do and still want. It's not easy. However, having a passion that arises within you is a blessing, even when there is little you can do physically or mentally. Just living with one's own little concerns, aches and pains, as important as they are, can become unbelievably boring without this other guiding passion. I'm not, of course, talking about being emotional. Most of the time, I have felt too exhausted for that. I have come to deeply appreciate James Hillman's picture of attending to one's own acorn, one's own life unfolding potential, one's original gifting to community. I found my year 2000 manuscript a week ago. I was shocked to read it. I feel I have been on a long journey into wordlessness, suffering, enduring, and an interminably slow greening since I left off writing it. I'm not alone in these fluctuating states. I've conscientiously watched television programs of people around the world suffering, with no one to care for them, with little food to eat, and often with the total disruption of their communities and families. I have found it important to watch and be with these people. Some may think I'm morbid, but by comparison, I have realized my own good fortunes. I am one of the sick and the lonely. I have been drawn back to gratitude for my life and into even deeper empathetic resonance with those who suffer wherever they are, and indeed the hurts of the earth herself It has felt necessary to align myself once again with those who live in open vulnerability, those who receive care and those who offer care. Just now, as I start writing again, I feel like one who has been cast up on the beach after shipwreck. My lungs are coughing out the excesses of salt from what I have come to call the Chernobyl syndrome, radiation. My body feels the hardness of the beach pebbles beneath it. I can hear the interminable roll of the pebbles as they're sucked back into the temporarily abated ocean swell. My great-grandfather had been through such an experience. He had been coxswain of the lifeboat in a beautiful town on the shores of South England. In those days, getting the lifeboats to sea was by dint of muscle, deep knowledge of the ocean, and her often capricious and fierce nature and community effort. When the flare soared into the storm clouds, even the women and children would come to help. Sometimes the boat would be washed back to the beach time and again because of the lack of automation that we now take for granted. Of course, they all lived in streets around the lifeboat house. They were a community of fishermen and their families. Their lifeboat duty was performed compassionately, bravely, and without pay. During one terrible storm, called to help those in distress upon the sea, the lifeboat was eventually launched into the terrible gale and enormous waves. After some time of struggle, my grandfather was washed overboard and given up for drowned, only to be discovered the next morning, limp but alive on the noisy, sea-sucked pebbles. He never fully recovered, but his story after survival was a remarkable one, radical, joyful, and playful. This isn't the place to tell it, but the story has rung in the bones of our family. Perhaps we all have a stubborn streak. One of my friends, who has bravely walked with me on a very dark path, has often commented with gratitude for my stubbornness. We've laughed about it. It was a learning for me. The story of my living in death's field through my experience with cancer, and my experiences of the story of Mary Magdalene resulting in my year 2000 manuscript, needed to find a way to walk hand in hand. They are both part of my life. During my illness, I dreamed I was in Paris, walking around, searching, as I did when I was on my sabbatical, for hints here and there about the enigmatic and archetypal Mary Magdalene. In this dream, I was constantly confronted with yards and yards of material hanging in every direction right in front of my face. How was my present illness like my search for Mary in Paris? Just like this. I had to keep walking forward, not knowing where I was going, making my way through yards and yards of fabric. Fortunately for me, during the last few years, when my manuscript has been boxed away, other books have been published on the story of Mary Magdalene. I find them consolidating for me. Furthermore, I've been deeply enriched by walking alongside of many who suffer in their bodies and souls, some who are no longer in this reality, and many who offer gracious care, superb skills, and love to those of us in deep physical and spiritual need. I hope my two stories can marry through moments of grace, endurance, humor, and the will of creation. I hope I can be stubborn enough to finish the journey. Today, I saw a picture of the wheelchair used by Renoir during the last years of his life in beautiful Provence, where I have spent so much time following the newly evolving story of Mary Magdalene. We can all appreciate Renoir's beautiful paintings now, the dappled tree light that draws the paintings into dance, the merging and contrasting of colors that we barely knew existed. But in his early years, people hated his work. They thought it was crude, too simply made, merely of smudges and blurred boundaries. For his last 20 years, He lived with great physical pain due to arthritis. During these years, he had to have his paintbrushes tied into his hands and his canvases hung from pulleys so that, in changing their height, he could keep painting right to the end. He commented that hands didn't matter that much. What was important, he said, was what was in his mind, what he wanted to create. Obviously, he wasn't talking about just intellect, and obviously he still used and valued his hands as best he could. I was very touched by his story and remarkable devotion to his painting, his acts of creation that filled him with a passion for life right into his death. It seems to me that he lived his love and his passion. Finding the words of Sydney Carter helps me stay with the reality that we are all dying and we are all living. Creation seems to bind these two states together. I don't know what happens at death. I only know that it's a profound mystery that I have been close to at times. As profound as birth. Carter's words are used by Dr. Sheila Cassidy to describe the kind of care offered by herself and others serving in hospices for the dying. To me, they are none other than the expression of a deep levity of love, the meaning and outrageous insights and loving actions of one called Mary Magdalene. No revolution will come in time to alter this man's life except the one surprise of being loved. He has no interest in civil rights, neo-Marxism, psychiatry, or any kind of sex. He has only 12 more hours to live, so never mind about a cure for cancer, smoking, leprosy, or osteoarthritis. Over this dead loss to society, you pour your precious ointment. Call the bluff and laugh at the fat and clock-faced gravity of our economy. You wash the feet that will not walk tomorrow. Come, levity of love, show him, show me, in the last step of time, eternity, leaping and capering.